welcome to the latest in Ruud Pedersen's series of Climate Talks webinars, the fifth in the series. Good to have you all back, those of you who've joined us from previous webinars. I normally at this point announce the next speakers that we have confirmed, but on this occasion I want to let you know that we're going to be taking a break for Easter, and but it's probably not going to be the final webinar series. We're hoping to come back with a very senior policymaker later in the month, not completely confirmed yet, and as soon as the person is confirmed we'll let you know, but for now we're going to take a break from the series. For those of you who weren't able or were able to join us for the previous webinars, just to let you know that the two first webinars from the first week, that was with Diederik Samson, the Chef de Cabinet of Frans Timmermans, and Jos Becker from the European University Institute in Florence. Videos, you can watch those two webinars on YouTube, and I understand if you click in the offers on the right hand side, you see a little red tab. If you click on that, you get a number of options, and in offers there you should see a link to those two videos. The videos of the two webinars that we had last week will be uploaded this week, and we will send an email to let you know about those. So hopefully, we know that there has been a lot of interest in going back and seeing what was said, and for people who weren't able to join on the day themselves. Okay, great. Today's guest is Elena Višnar Malinovská. Elena, thanks very much for joining us today. Elena is a head of unit in DG Klima, dealing with adaptation issues. We have Peter Fiss, our normal guest discussant. Peter's a senior advisor here together with me at Ruud Pedersen, former chef de cabinet to the climate commissioner, and Joanna Lepmetz, who consultant here at Ruud Pedersen, who will be taking charge of the questions, filtering up the questions, and managing the online polls and the results. So let's get started. And Joanna, do you want to post the first or put up the first poll for participants to join in? So we wanted to start the discussion about adaptation and how it fits together with what we call mitigation, the focus on reducing emissions. So let's just leave up there, invite you all to vote while we're starting the discussion. So Elena, do you want to maybe start just briefly explaining what adaptation is for those, if there are any people in the audience that don't know, and then maybe come on to the poll question there, which is there competition between adaptation and mitigation?
All right. Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. Pleased to be with you. I would start first by picturing a little bit the situation for the adaptation. Just imagine you are a wrestler. You are in a ring, right, and you get a punch. I mean, first time you have no memory of this punch, of this impact, right? So you do the bad move, you get the punch. Next time you see the impact or the punch coming, you start moving away of it, or even better, advancing and returning the punch back. And in the third instance, your memory is already perfect. You know something about this impact, and you transform the way the body goes. And just what I try to picture you is the way adaptation works. Adaptation is about bouncing back and bouncing back and bouncing back better than before. It's to react to the impacts and to somehow adapt around those impacts so that next time you will be ready to get the impact and you will not get harmed. This is maybe a complicated explanation, but indeed climate resilience is with us already for quite some time. And what we know best are probably the typical engineering solutions, like the flood defense measures. Mm-hmm. But nowadays, adaptation may be including organizational changes in a city. For instance, you will move your maternity departments more to the ground in the hospitals, whereas before you had them under roof, and during the heat waves, you can imagine what kind of impact it can have. You can have different insurance products that will allow you to transfer the risk for damage in case you suffer it. So the portfolio of adaptation measures or adaptation options has become relatively rich. Now, does preparing for adaptation compete with the focus on reducing emissions? I would say for many, it still does, because allocation of funds. And you know very well, the best adaptation is to reduce drastically emissions. And this will require a lot of investments. Whereas when it comes to adaptation, you don't know to what we are actually adapting. Yeah, it's outside our zone of influence. It's outside our zone of control. We can go climate neutral in Europe, yet we can be hit by climate impacts because the other major economies, they do nothing. Yeah, they do little.
Exactly. So how do you plan for adaptation when you don't know what you might need to adapt to, the scale of the challenges you might need to adapt to? How do you? What's your methodology?
I use the slogan, let's plan for the worst and be, hope for the best. But we are not anymore in this setup. We are delayed on action to reduce emissions. We see already the impacts. We cannot allow the same to happen. So we should first go with no regret measures, all right? I mean, a typical no regret measure is greening the cities. Mm-hmm. It has a lot of multifunctional benefits. Clearly, it can reduce, air pollution. It can maintain water on roofs. It is aesthetic. It is reducing the heat island in the city. So it has a lot of pluses. You can tick immediately, and it's a no regret option.
Sorry, can I just maybe bring Peter in for a moment on Peter? How have you've been working on climate policy for a long time. I mean, has adaptation, has it always been a priority, or has it suffered with the focus on mitigation?
Well, there's never been a conflict between the two. It's true that at the beginning of the Commission's policy making on climate change, we concentrated on trying to put in place measures that would reduce emissions. That was, if you like, the priority. The most immediate priority was to try to stop making climate change worse by slowing the rate of emissions. But indeed, we've always known that adaptation should be part of the policy mix. And it's always been something that we've given due importance to. The question that we have dealt with over the years is really whether or not the EU as such was the right level to make policies on climate change, adaptation, because obviously the impacts of climate change will depend where you are. They will be local impacts. And so the measures taken are essentially local measures, and local people will know best what to do. But, while accepting that importance of local role, we've always believed that there was some added value in the EU doing things in this area, and I'm sure that's still the case. But essentially, what adaptation has always been seen as is a preparing yourself for effects of climate change that are rather inevitable, even with the temperature increase that has happened so far, that we will be suffering effects of that. And depending on where you are, you want to be trying to address and strengthen your resilience to those impacts. That's really what I suppose this is all about.
I interrupted you a little bit, Elena, but you were talking there. I mean, clearly, it's very easy to see at a local level, people who live in coastal areas obviously will share the political priority and the funding priority of coastal defences. People who live in areas susceptible to forest fires will do the same. But you clearly are taking a more holistic approach. So across society, measures that boost resilience, not just for the most vulnerable geographical regions or areas.
No, I think what is it's a long-term process. The planning is an ancient art. We have forgotten about it, and we need to do the planning, and often it is 20, 30 years of project making. Look at Copenhagen. They had in, I think, 2011, the cloudburst event, you know, and they are now engaging in the process of, protecting the city with a system, relatively complex system of water pools in case of these flash rains, which will last for the next 20 years in terms of infrastructure and is a long-term investment. So we cannot wait until the impact is really felt so that we start doing something about it. And there, I must say, whoever you asked already in Europe about whether they can picture a certain impact of climate change, they will have an answer. Is it a heat wave? Is it a windstorm? Is it, a blackout in certain countries that they lived it as a cascading, effect of several such events? So everybody has now a memory of what a weather event and extreme looks like. And indeed, what we are very good at in Europe is forecasting, modeling, and foresight capacities. So you can, in terms of the forecasting with the satellite data and with the projections, you can see what level of water scarcity maybe your land, farming land, will be. Or if you are indeed at the coast, you can see whether your house may be underwater in maybe 20, 30 years, etc. So I think nobody is being spared anymore. It's not anymore even discussion about this is for developing countries, this is for the Kiribatis of this world. No. It's now for everybody, in some way to adjust so that we can continue with the activities in a relatively seamless fashion.
Okay. Peter, are you fine? Do you want to come in there, or?
Some of all effects, I think, are local to some extent, but the local can sometimes extend over bigger areas. Just to mention one potential effect that might start in the southern Europe and perhaps spread is airborne diseases. I'm thinking of, mosquito-borne diseases and things like that, which might impact Europe as temperatures rise. Of course, it will perhaps start in the hotter climates, but it will move over Europe. So really, we are all, and we're living through such a health crisis right now that we should all be concerned about the well-being of Europe in a hotter temperature. And the health effects are one example where I think we should all be preparing for increasing our resilience. It's pretty obvious to say that in the health crisis we're experiencing, but there are climate change, there are effects on health through climate change, and we must increase our resilience to prepare for them.
Yeah, I wanted to come on to the lessons of the coronavirus crisis, but maybe it's a good point to let's just have should we have a quick look at the results of the first poll and then open the second one, and maybe take questions from the floor if we have some, Joanna.
So the poll results are the following: that 61% of our audience thinks that preparing for adaptation does not compete with the focus on reducing emissions. 25% thinks it does, and 13% says no. And a question from the audience, I could say, is, for example, on the topic of geoengineering, how does if and how does that help to control climate change?
Yeah, Elena, do you want to come in on that topic? Maybe explain maybe briefly explain what it is in case anyone doesn't know.
Yeah.
Well, geoengineering are typically the techniques where you play a little bit with the albedo effect, with radiation. Maybe example, a very simple example, a good example maybe of a little geoengineering solution would be white roofs, typically. Which would reduce the heat in the house and adjust the thermal comfort. But then you have the geoengineering at huge scale, which has I would say unforeseen consequences. I'm from a communist country, and I still remember when sometimes the politicians came to visit our country and the forecast was rather bad. Suddenly the sun was shining, and this technique is called cloud seeding. You can have this, I would say, larger scale impacts, or people are talking about sun dimming, or about fertilization of oceans. And these are really techniques that have huge consequences, or can have huge consequences on ecosystems. So for me, for instance, the positive geoengineering, as we call it, is a massive tree planting, of course, respecting the biodiversity constraints, etc. But in general, what I'm very much afraid is that politicians in countries that can afford it, they will lose patience. And at some point, they will go into dangerous and so-called innovative technologies.
Yeah. So actually, that sort of leads us into the second poll. So maybe if you want to introduce that, Joanna, and then do we have any other questions? Because I have some related to the second poll. So I'd move on unless there are some good questions that you want to ask at this point.
I think there's one related, which comes from Francesco Mirizzi from the European Industrial Hemp Association, asking that rural areas are key for adaptation and mitigation. To what extent the adaptation in agriculture can be achieved while keeping the existing sectors in place? Should we rather focus on conversion plans?
It's a good question, Elena.
This is an extremely good question. And I think it's, again, a question of business strategies. Look at the Mediterranean basin, For the time being, the water resources, the scarce water resources that are there, for instance, in Spain, are mostly used for farming, for agriculture. They are used for really water-intensive, typically goods like strawberries or fruits, etc. So we are essentially, Spain is exporting water in its fruits. Now, the question is, what's next? You need to increase the supply of water. In a water arid area, you don't have it. So you can do it through desalinations. Probably it's one of the options to increase the water supply, but you need a huge investment. This needs to be a public, private investment. And of course, we know desalination is energy intensive. So it includes the trade-offs on the mitigation side.
Yeah.
Or you change the crop. You decide, okay, I will go into a more resistant crop, less water depending, etc. Or in extremes, you can move inside to greenhouses. We see now increasingly also these indoor agriculture. And last, of course, is retreat, organized retreat from certain activities. It's very similar to closing the mines. You need to close down an activity and do an organized move by the country to allow people to find other livelihoods or other activities.
But these are drastic in scenarios where you close sectors in certain places, of course. And really, I think, first of all, it puts the emphasis again on mitigation by way of trying to slow climate change and indeed stop climate change ultimately by reducing our emissions. We must never lose sight of that priority. But of course, yes, the inevitable changes to climate that we've already started by the emissions we've made in the past, we've got to think about strengthening resilience. But surely, I think I would say that early action can perhaps enable us to be more resilient so that we won't have to be relocating industries due to water shortages and so on. If we can perhaps produce agricultural produce without the same water demands, by, you know, producing the right crops in the right places and so on. I think we're trying to mitigate disastrous effects of extreme weather events, but we're also trying to reduce the costs of adaptation, of climate change. And that, I think, argues for early action in order to enable a smooth, gradual transition so that we don't have major disruptions in a short space of time, such as we're experiencing right now. Major disruption, and it's happening quickly.
And Peter, obviously, a part of the thrust of, or the way the European Green Deal is supposed to work is to cover all policies that make all activities that make a contribution that emit greenhouse gases. What do you, and that includes agriculture, because we know that ruminant animals are quite large producers of greenhouse gases, particularly methane. What kind of political battle and pushback do you expect from the agricultural sector on being included in the decarbonisation effort?
Well, I think the agricultural sector is a key sector for a number of reasons. One reason is that it is a source of emissions, as you described, from livestock rearing or from fertilizers use and so on. But also agriculture could provide us with one of those solutions, which is to, through changing agricultural practices, we can perhaps sequester more carbon, take carbon out of the atmosphere. And the agriculture and forestry sectors clearly have a major role to play there. So it's a sector where we've got to talk and engage with in order to sort of do the right things over time. And remembering, of course, that the agriculture sector is essential for providing food to us and the world at large. So it's a very basic need that they are supplying a service for. So I think we've got to be very, engagement is what it's all about, I think. And of course, if we can find solutions with Elena and her colleagues that were both climate beneficial and enable food production to continue at the levels we need in the future with a growing global population, then we're really talking about win-win solutions. Those are the ones we've got to be finding, and those are the ones we should prioritize as well.
Okay. Elena, I don't know if you want to come in on that at all.
I think, honestly, farmers are the ones who understand adaptation better than the other sectors, because they live the physical impacts on a daily basis. This is how they produce, etc. But agriculture is also important from the point of view of co-benefits. This is exactly where you can have one practice where you tick several boxes. It helps you adapting, and it helps you also decreasing emissions. But what we have seen in the recent years, I don't know whether you've heard about the massive outbreaks of bark beetle in Central Europe. And this is exactly a cascading effect of many years drought, mild winters, and then, of course, infestations of bark beetles that destroy the mostly monocultural spruce forests.
Right.
This has an impact on carbon sink. Actually, my half country, Czechia, over a few years has lost its carbon sink capacity. So it may be really huge. And for the future, the major, let's say, challenge I see for farming, it's on the forestry side. It's how will you, plant the forest of the future, the forest that is resilient, the forest that, can act as a carbon sink, because indeed, this is what we need. And it's not about a few trees planted somewhere in the city. It's really about creating, the new ecosystems. And there, what is really necessary is to preserve the old-grown forests, you know, to stop the logging that is still going on at large scale in the world.
So I'm glad just to hear. I'm glad just to hear the example that Elena gives, because when I mentioned health, of course, at the forefront of my mind was human health. But let's face it, animal health and plant health is equally important, and they will be impacted by climate change.
Can I cycle back to the health issues? All of the seminars, the webinars we've done, we've always started by asking people about the effect of the coronavirus. Because it was either policymakers or business representatives who were obviously, particularly the business representatives at the sharp end, because their factories are being closed and their construction sites are being closed down. But Elena, so question to you, what are the lessons of the coronavirus for adaptation strategy? And do you think adaptation could be squeezed out because of the focus on restarting economic activity?
No, I have no this fear. Actually, what we are living now is a really good case study of what happens if we continue to neglect the environmental degradation and what's going on around. We are in a situation where we are hit by a disease that has very severe consequences, yet it is a disease that is being spread via contact. So you can avoid it in a way, through relatively simple gestures, locking you down, etc. But if you would imagine a climate-induced, let's say, disease like Peter was mentioning at the beginning, typically malaria, dengue, and these that are being airborne or vector-borne, meaning transferred by mosquitoes. When you would imagine that they would just multiply, during heat waves, I mean, just imagine all these factors. Then you say, oh my God, but I really need to do something about adaptation. And in adaptation, we have a term of adaptive capacity, which means all these institutional capacity, but also hospitals to deal with your emergency situation. And for instance, when you look at forest fires in Europe, you had a situation in Sweden where 20,000 square kilometers were burned, but nobody died. And that's actually also a good indicator of a certain resilience of the country and of the robustness of the approaches. Whereas you have different countries in Europe, in the south, I don't want to nominate them, the lifestyle is different. So we have a situation where we deal with a relatively straightforward disease. We can have a multiplication of this situation in the future if we just don't listen. So my very simple answer would be no, I don't think we will be squeezed out. The links need to be made, the dots need to be connected, the intersectoral relationships need to be explained, the cascading impacts and the secondary impact that come after the events need to be visualized for people, but no. I think we now, what we live now, people can actually also test how it is now to go for a less carbon intensive lifestyle, if you wish. And I must say certain, of course, those whose livelihoods are less in danger are enjoying it, so that's also the possibility, to switch mobility, to switch shopping habits and so on.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question almost, to Elena, and that is to distinguish between the adaptation policy from remedial action. When we think of adaptation, we think of floods. Now, cleaning your house, drying your house after a flood is just repair, But that surely isn't what policy is about, is it?
No.
Tell us then.
No, adaptation policy is a preventive policy. It means that in the first place, you wouldn't clean the water from your house and you wouldn't have electricity breakdown, because you would have your electricity lines very much up, on the ceilings and not down. You wouldn't first have a house in the floodplain that is very vulnerable, etc. But that's also the problem of adaptation. We are often talking about invisible damage avoided. So when you see a weather event striking, this always fills out the lines, the headlines of news. But you may have weather striking, and without damage, and nobody will even notice. But this can be the very proof of a good adaptation activity upfront. So it's a real difficulty to talk about the invisible damage. And I still remember a picture of a house on Piloti in the US, in a bay, where the owner of this house has invested double the price in every square meter of his house, just to protect it against wave surges. And during the hurricane, I don't remember which name was it, you would see the picture of destruction where all the houses around were destroyed, just his house kept standing. And that's the picture of adaptation in life. But unfortunately, we don't have so many of those to compare with in the first place.
You've made a link to what is going to be my next question about international cooperation, because part of your area of responsibility in DG Klima is international aspects. Let me put it sort of provocatively. I mean, can we? Surely it's up to other countries to deal with particularly the rich, the wealthier ones, to work out their own adaptation strategies. So what role can the EU play there?
Well, actually, we should watch their way, because this is what they live now. We will be living maybe in the future. So there are good case studies out there for our survival. But let me answer you more concretely. I mean, first of all, we need to engage with these countries also so that they reduce emissions. I mean, that's clear. We need to have a sort of contract with them that even the development pathways won't be the same as ours, and that they, take into account the new technologies if they can afford it, or we can help them. There are countries in Africa where let's say the lack of energy system they benefit, because they can go very quickly to decentralized renewables. Like, for instance, Tanzania has all these small renewables panel, etc. So what we can offer to them is certainly, knowledge, how to do planning. And a lot of our funding goes into doing this, strengthening the capacities, doing the planning at communities level, etc. We try also to reinforce the scientific cooperation, because we see the south to south cooperation doesn't work always. So that's really important. We, help them with how to make the adaptation happen. So first you need to see where I'm vulnerable, then what is the risk, what is the adaptation option I can go for, is it technical, is it organizational, is it a financial one, etc. So there are many ways to go about it. But just to say, without adaptation, we wouldn't have a Paris Agreement, because this was a contract between the North and the South. The North more interested about reducing emissions, and the South already living the impacts of climate change and not contributing that much to the emissions worldwide. So it covers interests of the, if you wish, of the whole world.
Okay, Peter, do you want to come in on that? Otherwise,
Well, I think, as always, Europe is not going to solve climate alone. Climate challenges are far too big, but we can try to share expertise. Indeed, we can learn from each other in Europe, and then we can perhaps share what learning we do with other countries who have critical needs and less ability to model, to do geo monitoring and things. We have satellite monitors and things. I think we can help others. That's what we are ready to do, both in terms of policy making development and in terms of adaptation. I'm sure there's a lot of easy wins there. But I wanted also to have a conversation about business at some stage, Simon. I hope we can talk about businesses.
Well, I mean, finance is the next section. So
okay.
if we're dealing with that, but Joanna, do we have any questions from the floor? And also, I think we should look at the results of the second poll and then open the third one. Any?
There is a remark on the picture that you just painted about the house in the US. So there is a comment from Anne de Gulaquer from Cementis, which is that adaptation for housing, especially in the USA, would be to build with more concrete, but that would add CO2 emissions.
Depends. You don't need to. You can use different materials. You can use green solutions. Depends what climate hazard are you adapting to. Very much. You can have combined solutions. Many times, the gray with green, it does work. I'm not personally an architect, neither am I a civil engineer, but I know how much in the first years you have to invest knowledge how to do the cement right. The drainage systems, if you build a terrace, and you have flash rains, how to evacuate the water not to get it inside. So I would say it's an art, and it doesn't stop at just adding more concrete here and there. Not at all. And of course, it's location specific. It very much depends where you are, what kind of hazard you are exposed to.
And Elena, I'm not sure you were advocating a model where very rich people pay twice as much to make their houses safe, and everyone else just who's not as wealthy gets their houses washed away by floods. I'm not sure that's your ideal model of resilience.
No, but I don't know how many times do you want to pay for your house? And we stay in Czech. I'm not so rich to buy cheap things.
Right.
And what about
wisdom? Okay.
Elena, on that subject, are nature-based solutions cheaper? I mean, what are nature-based solutions, perhaps? I mean, I think of a river where it would flood, and that it would be good to create some space where the river can flood upstream so that it doesn't perhaps flood urban areas downstream. Yeah. Is that a nature-based solution?
Yeah. Sure. Rhine is a good example. In Bonn, they just designed designated places where the river goes out when it needs to, where it's absorbed, etc. Nothing is worse than, really building close to these water courses. And this is where real estate can make a difference. I know we love to live near water, but water can, in flash storms, become a real risk, real danger to us. So indeed, you have all these green roof solutions. You can replace the air ventilators by, just planting trees around the building. But of course, it requires a lot of design thinking, and we very much know that construction sector today is very much standardized prototype buildings, but at the same time there are many standards that are being now developed exactly for resilience. That there are the standardization bodies looking at the standards that exist in energy, transport, industry, building. And they include the resilience element, and the next step will be really the green elements. And once the standardization bodies will talk to civil engineers about the green, I think that's already progress.
Okay, so that's a nice segue into our next topic, but let's round off this section with the results of the second poll and then open the third poll.
Yes, so the results of the first poll are about the role of the EU, what should be the role that the EU has in the development of adaptation strategies by member states. And 80% of our public thinks that EU should have an important role, and 20% thinks a minor. And there's a question from Isabel Santos from the Advanced Fuel Solutions asking, who are the most important stakeholders that help the EU take decisions on climate change? Is it companies, researchers, consultants?
This is a very, very good question. It's a mixture. I think it is a mixture. I mean, first of all, I think we had a period, maybe 30 years ago, where the researchers saw it coming, and it was a little bit invisible to everybody. But today, I must tell you, it's many times comes from companies, because they bring on-stream technological solutions that can help, very simple solutions sometimes that can be replicated at large scale. I see mayors, so the local city policymakers, who are very much, you know, seeing what it costs the city when it has to rebuild, you know, after a flood, or when they have a death toll after a heat wave. You know, we are following now the numbers of deaths on a daily basis, but just a few years ago, France had 15,000 casualties during heat waves, few months of heat waves. So it can be really, really huge. So I would say, you know, today it's every more informed citizen, even if he is in a function also that can influence it. And by the way, I believe many times I hear negative notes on businesses. I think every CEO also, when he or she comes home, they want to have clean air, fresh water. They see the impacts. I've heard very inspirational speeches about environmental impacts exactly from these people. So
yeah, so that's actually a good point to move on to our next discussion and to have the third poll, because it's about the role of finance. Joanna, you want to?
It's published.
Okay, great. So yeah, well, so the next thing to discuss really, and you talked about the role of business, Elena, is what the EU is planning on sustainable finance, and how that will affect adaptation and resilience, and to what extent it's a sort of positive feedback loop, because you have on the one hand, you have the risks from climate change and not adapting sensibly or in a realistic time frame, but also you have a method, and maybe you could sort of explain a little bit how it will work in practice with this dreadfully named taxonomy. But you know, you know, are we going to be able to have a positive feedback loop on those initiatives?
okay, thanks a lot. I'll start probably with a figure. Actually, in Europe, we incur 12 billion losses per year, and it doesn't, in terms of losses from weather events, and it doesn't count at all the human lives, the ecosystem impacts, or the business continuity impacts in value chains, etc. So it's huge, and it will become even bigger. Now, what can the finance do? I mean, typically what we need to do is to reorient the capital towards the good purposes, okay? When it comes to reducing emissions, maybe this is more straightforward, because everybody has heard about, you know, electric vehicle, or about a smart grid, about a battery, about renewables. Not everybody is really aware of what is the emblematic solution for adaptation. So where should I put, in which basket should I put the eggs, and so on. And there, the reply we have from the finance is that every single economic activity should somehow be adapted, should become resilient, because every activity will have to live in a changing climate. So all the conditions around will change. Typically, when I am the electricity transmission operator, and I'm facing every year situations with frost, with windstorms, etc., all these transmission lines that you see and that are quite ugly in a landscape will actually encounter difficulties. So you have countries like Finland, where they actually already in regulatory terms decided that these lines need to be buried underground. That's one of the solutions, just to picture you that. Now, many would say, okay, but this is for the public sector, for the state, right? This is not really for a private investor. This is not a palatable case, etc. Now, we had a taxonomy discussion, and in the taxonomy that was now proposed by technical expert group in its report, and I must say, Commission has not yet given its final say as when it comes to technical screening criteria. But what is important on adaptation is that indeed it should be universal. Every single activity should be adapted. Second, it's a process-based approach. So you have certain principles that you have to follow. For instance, all the material risks to your activity should be reduced. You shouldn't, with your act, for instance, when you are next to river, you are one industry, you should not, with your act, create adverse climatic risks to the other users. You should use the climate projections, for instance, looking 10, 20 years ago. Now, what you will see from the taxonomy is that it will be at the beginning challenging for many businesses to. And
just to be clear, the taxonomy, it's a list. It's a dreadful word, but it's a list of activities. It's a
library. It's still a very incomplete library that will say under which circumstances a certain activity is sustainable. And once it is sustainable, it is taxonomy compliant. And so the businesses can say, okay, I invested so much of my operational capital or my my equity is in taxonomy compliant activities. Now, for the adaptation so far, it's not the equity, it's just the cost of what the activity brings to another activity and how it makes resilient. So it's just the additional cost. Exactly for the reason, just imagine you have a coal mine. The coal mine can cause leakage of minerals around, can be close to a river. So you want to make it resilient, but then of course, if you would count the equity of the coal mine, you would de facto make something taxonomy compliant, although it is a mitigation incompatible activities. This is why only the coating over the activity that is making it resilient is now counting as the adaptation investment. Now, there are activities for us that are pure play adaptation. For instance, we mentioned the floodplain management solutions. I mean, this would be typically an enabling activity. This would be typically a sort of adaptation solution. Or you could think of insurance. Certain insurers really already go into, more signaling through the premiums for better and disaster-proof attitudes. So you could think some of these insurance products are already pure play adaptation solutions. But this second part has not yet been fully examined by the group, and honestly, the Commission will not have time in the coming days to do that, to fix that. But it definitely is for the future to think about these pure play adaptation solutions. Mm-hmm. Now, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, Peter, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the fact that the European Green Deal communication that the Commission adopted at the end of last year includes an initiative to review the non-financial reporting directive in 2020. Now, what is the non-financial disclosure directive? It's basically a requirement that big companies produce sustainability reports, and that those sustainability reports they they describe the exposure of the business to risks of climate change and their contribution to climate change. And so basically that's something that is already on a law, but the Commission is looking to review it. And perhaps what I should already say in the context of adaptation is that the Commission's guidelines on how to report your climate impacts, it includes adaptation. It includes a business describing whether or not it is vulnerable to extreme weather events, or whether it is chronically vulnerable to floods or other climate impacts. So I think this adaptation is not to be forgotten, even in the context of this non-financial disclosures directive context. And indeed, the Commission might strengthen those provisions, very likely, when it amends the legislation. So very much to be watched.
Yeah, sure. I think that's been clearly signalled. Let's take some more questions because we're going into the final 10 minutes of the webinar.
There is a question from Robert Bernetta from the EIB. Are there successful business models for adaptation? This would allow to bring in private sector and mobilize financing for such measures.
Good question. For you, Elena, I think.
It's... To be very honest with you, for the time being, we struggle with finding good business cases, and colleagues from EIB know it because we are working together on a financial instrument that is called National Capital Financial Instrument. And we still don't have a real pipeline of the projects. But let me go into what could be the good technological solutions. I mean, typically, where business should invest is, in buildings, in providing the thermal comfort in buildings, and I'm not talking just air conditioning and ventilation, but, more integrated resilience of the building. Just an anecdote, we are in DG Klima in Bollieu, and when we had windstorms, I can tell you I've understood very well what a resilient or non-resilient building was when some of the parts of the building were falling apart. So, I mean, resilience is definitely part of the construction of buildings. The case must be there. Second, in the future for water technologies, with the water scarcity and the water stress, there will be more and more pressure on very efficient water technologies or increasing the supply possibilities. And there, of course, those who will come out with desalination or additional technologies that are emission-free, I mean, these will be cutting edge. And I'm not talking about just innovation community. I'm sure there are already startups and companies looking at it. There is the whole space of cities, where, of course, we always know how much does it cost when a bridge falls apart. What it is. We need to make sure that indeed the infrastructure can withstand the extremes. It's very interesting, the rail sector, how they look at, tracks and, components. So very much the component industry needs to look into these matters. Data analytics. I always say, that's my slogan, we are snowed by data, but we are hungry for knowledge. And we really see a lot of data coming in, but we just don't understand what this data wants to tell us. And in the future, there will be a lot of work on data analytics, artificial intelligence, data mining that can transform this, huge amount of data into something that is very relevant. It's a service. It is a new service economy that will tell you, what will happen. We talk a lot about e-health, that you would find out, that something will happen to you and that you need to go to the hospital 5 minutes before it happens. Just picture it out for the climate risk and future climate impact. Aircraft industry. Have you ever flown in a storm? I mean, I would prefer not to. And indeed, for the future, the monitoring devices for aircrafts or all these, airplanes will be extremely important. Again, a business case for, and these solutions can be looked as part of the, if you want, adaptation business solutions.
So what I hear in that, if I can just say, Elena is making very clear to me that businesses can be solution providers. I don't know whether that's a business model, but clearly businesses in the building business, the farmers, the pharmaceutical companies that might, all of these people, all of these businesses can help prepare the resilience with a view to adaptation to climate change. So, there are ways, and I think adaptation needs to be in the business plans of many big businesses, in any case, because it's required by the Financial Disclosures Directive, but also to look for the opportunities where they can be solution providers.
Yeah.
Let me just, we're into the last 5 minutes. Let's just have the results of the third poll, and then, because the fourth poll question is very relevant to this discussion, and I want to be able to give people a chance to vote on that. And we'll also see if there's any more questions.
So the third poll was about if the EU Sustainable Finance Initiative can contribute to adoption efforts, and 58% of our audience thinks that yes, but only to a limited extent, and only 40% of audience thinks that yes. 1%
maybe a slightly disappointing result, Elena, but okay, let's have the next poll as well, so that
it's a very clear yes.
So let's call it up.
So this is really, Elena, in a way, I don't want to personalize this, but sort of a test of how persuasive you've been on whether you think spending on adaptation is a good use of public funds. So we'll just open the poll there. Do we have any more questions, Joanna, that we should take from the floor before we're into the final 3 minutes?
I think we're doing quite good right now.
Okay. Okay.
There is a question, for example, about what we already discussed in the last webinar as well, but new views perhaps on adding EU ETS to buildings.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to maybe just quickly, Elena, do you want to have a go at that? We're in the final 3 minutes, so it would have to be a relatively short answer about adding the building sector to the ETS, and if that's something in your area of responsibility, not directly your area of responsibility, but...
It's not my area of responsibility. I know there have been a lot of studies before, and Peter remembers I worked a little bit with the EU ETS maybe 15 years ago. When you just look at the scope of the ETS and industrial installations, and you then add buildings, it's very different. But of course, it's outside my, let's say, expertise. And as you know, it has been promised in the political guidelines to look at the question once again.
So we're into the last 2 minutes, and let's just, and I know people like us finishing by 2 because they have other meetings. So, Joanna, let's just share the results of the poll, because I think it's good news for Elena, and I think she's, hopefully she'll feel that her hour with us was well spent.
So the results are displayed, and we have 83% of the public thinking that yes, public spending on adaptation is a good use of public funds because it helps to increase the resilience of our society.
Well, chapeau, a little small round of applause. So I think we will we'll wrap it up at that point. Thanks to Elena and our speakers, Peter and Joanna today, and thanks to all of you for joining online. Don't forget, you can go into the offers section and get links to the videos of the first 2 webinars, and we'll be uploading the second set in the course of this week. And then we'll be taking a break, and hopefully maybe coming back with a very senior climate policy, energy policy speaker later in the month. So I'm going to close that and wish you all a good Easter or a good holiday, whatever form you manage to take it in. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Elena. Goodbye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.